Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Lab Policy Roundtable. We try to organize these conversations around issues that are both current and important. And for Pakistan, one of the most important issues these days is the relationship with the new Biden administration and relations with the US in general. Over the last several days, there's been a lot of speculation, a lot of analysis, a lot of advice that's been given. As some of you will know, and hopefully all of you will now go and check, the Lab produced a document that was meant to serve as a guide, a set of 7 driving principles that should shape the future of Pakistan-US relations. When we spoke to friends in Washington and other places, and some even here in Pakistan, they said we were being a bit optimistic, locating Afghanistan and its role in the Pakistan-US relationship way down the order of things that we think are really important between the US and Pakistan. So what we did is we decided to go and talk to people who know better. And over the last several weeks, we've seen some, as usual, phenomenal reporting from Kathy Gannon of the Associated Press. We've seen a really long piece by Adam Weinstein, which is not in any way a criticism of the long piece. It's an indicator of how detailed it is. And we also saw the USIP piece by Ambassador Rick Olson, who served in Islamabad during some really tumultuous times for the Pakistan-US relationship. I'm really delighted to welcome all 3 of you, grateful to you for making the time to join us. And maybe, Kathy, maybe start with you and ask you to just walk us through the process of reporting on this complex trifecta. Although increasingly it seems like Russia has something to say about that, China has something to say about that, the Iranian government has things to say about that. Of course, the Qataris are super important. What is the most important thing outside Afghanistan for Afghanistan peace? And is the Pakistan-US relationship completely dependent on what happens in Afghanistan?
Okay, big questions there, Musharraf. Outside of Afghanistan, what's the single most important thing? I think most Afghans would tell you Pakistan. Outside of Afghanistan, the single most important. But that doesn't in any way diminish the roles of Iran, of Russia, of China, of India. Everyone in the region has a role, Saudi Arabia. Afghanistan, unfortunately, has always been a place where different countries come in to try and wield influence. But I think from Afghanistan's perspective, the most important outside of Afghanistan is Pakistan. How does that bode for the US-Pakistan relationship? Unfortunately, I think that in the last 20 years, the relationship between the US and Pakistan has been mostly seen through the prism of Afghanistan. So it's been a very single lens look, I think, by the United States of its relationship with Pakistan. And it's certainly not the first time. Of course, in the 1980s, it was much the same. And then all relations broke off in 1990 after the Russians left. So this is not new. And unfortunately, if you look at how history keeps playing itself out in this region, there seems to be a lot more repetitiveness in terms of a history repeating itself than sort of lessons learned, and how do you move forward, and how do you make change, and how do you come up with something innovative and new. And I think at this point, I think it seems to be much the same in terms of the Pakistan-US relationship. And I think, again, and I think rightly, Afghanistan is right, that the most significant player outside of its own borders is Pakistan right now.
If that's the case, then is it true for us to assume that if Pakistan and the US can't agree on what to do in Afghanistan, how Afghanistan should play out, whether Pakistan has done enough, whether the US has done enough, if there are outstanding disagreements between Pakistan and the US on Afghanistan, on the issues around Afghanistan, is there anything else that's possible within the Pakistan-US relationship, or is the whole relationship contingent on this single item?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's certainly up to both Pakistan and the US. Again, because Pakistan has been seen through the prism of Afghanistan for much of the last 20 years. There's only been little dips into something else, some discussion about quotas and some discussion about trade. Certainly the US is looking at China's relationship with Pakistan and how does that impact the region, its relationship with Russia. I think if Pakistan and the US cannot agree on how to go forward in Afghanistan, although I do think that there will be an agreement on how to go forward in Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is such a complicated problem, and so many issues in terms of coming to a solution or a place where Afghanistan can begin to try to find a relationship among its own people to where there'll be peace. It is so complicated, but I certainly think both the US and Pakistan are on the same page in terms of they want a political settlement. I think Pakistan and the US are very clear on knowing what the issues are. The question is, what is each prepared to do, and with the people that they have some influence over, to impact change on both sides. So I think there is an agreement on what to do on Afghanistan requiring a political solution. And both sides know exactly what they could possibly do, but are they willing to on both sides? And it's both sides. So that's my thought anyway.
Great. Rick, the piece that you wrote for USIP, I thought was really interesting coming from Washington. It isn't every day that there's a hint of possibility. I wouldn't call it optimism, but possibility in terms of expansion and going beyond what you call tired old narratives, which is exactly right. And a lot of folks in Pakistan, found that to resonate with them. You obviously talk about China and the US's Indo-Pacific strategy as a long-term shaper of the future of the relationship. But there seems to be, at least in some of the friends that I've spoken to in DC, a sense of alarm that actually, listen, I mean, one friend said, listen, Musharraf, it's great that you have all these ideas about climate change and China and all this other stuff, but really at the end of the day, it's Afghanistan and counterterrorism, and it's make or break. Obviously, this isn't a helpful thing for me, it's helpful from an analytical perspective, but if that's what General McKenzie was saying to General Bajwa yesterday, and it didn't seem like he was, I don't know if that would work. In your experience, is that the right approach for the Biden administration to take?
Good evening, and pleasure to be with you. Let me say that I think that this is, I look at this as kind of an issue of sequencing, and I agree completely with Kathy's analysis of the Afghanistan issue. But let me take a little step back here and talk a little bit about what I think the Biden administration's kind of priorities are going to be, and then we can see how Pakistan kind of fits in. Obviously, the first priority for the Biden administration is domestic. We've got a lot of issues in the United States right now, the pandemic, the economic recovery from the pandemic. The Biden administration emphasizes dealing with systemic racism. And then there's underlying all of this is the sort of the threats to our democracy, frankly, that have to be dealt with. When you shift to foreign policy, the priorities, in the near term are going to be, restoring alliances, restoring U.S. strategic predictability, restoring our relationship with multilateral institutions, and that has already begun. And you've seen that signaling at NATO, and you've rejoined WHO and Paris Accord, all those kinds of things. But on substance, I think over time, and it's early days for the Biden administration, but I think the big things that they will want, the big agenda items that they will want to address are climate change, China, Iran, and Afghanistan. And if I were to list them in terms of not importance, that's sort of in how it gets listed in importance. But in terms of urgency, it's the opposite. Okay, Afghanistan has to be dealt with right away. Iran has to be dealt with in the near term. And then the question of China and great power competition, which this administration seems to endorse it broadly as a concept, is going to be the framing device, I think, for US foreign policy going forward. So to me, this is, the question of Afghanistan is a sequencing issue. The United States is signaling that it wants to be in the end game for Afghanistan. Whether we're in the end game is an open question, and there's lots of room for skepticism there, because Afghanistan, as we all know, is the graveyard of best laid plans. Let's put it that way. So there are real questions as to whether we will be able to get the peace process going. And I agree with Kathy that right now the U.S. and Pakistan are actually pretty aligned strategically. And let me be very candid on that. The reason that we are aligned on Afghanistan is because the U.S. has moved to basically adopt Pakistan's position. Okay, that's not something any U.S. government official is going to say, and I'm a retired official, so I can say it. But the reality is that we have come to accept the Pakistan strategic position in some ways with regard to Afghanistan, in some ways, at least on the importance of arriving at a political settlement rather than a military solution, which is something that we have been hearing about from Pakistan for quite some time. And I'm not suggesting there are no divergences between the US and Pakistan, there certainly are. But I think Pakistan should keep that in mind, that the US has basically moved much closer to the Pakistan position over the past couple of years. And I think that we do have a degree of strategic convergence. But I would say, just to close it out on Afghanistan, it's going to depend how it ends. The United States wants to be in an end game. Rigorous way to do this is generate a bunch of scenarios, and we could do that, and we could talk through what the various scenarios are for Afghanistan. But let me just say that if it ends with some kind of political settlement, and the U.S. withdraws military forces, and there's some degree of stability in Afghanistan, I think that sets the stage for a positive reset in U.S.-Pakistan relations. If it ends very badly, if the U.S. in effect has to withdraw and it brought Afghanistan under pressure, and Afghanistan collapses into chaos, and I'm drawing too extreme, obviously there are a lot of scenarios in between here. Then I think that the prospect for a U.S.-Pakistan relationship being reset is much less likely. Why don't I stop there?
Great. I think, so I want to take the conversation to Adam, but before I do, it seemed like Kathy had a couple of reactions to something you said. I know I did. I'm going to hold off on mine, but Kathy, if you could unmute and just give us your reaction there.
Sure. I mean, the reason that the U.S. wants a political solution is because militarily it's not being very successful. Whether there's chaos or not isn't necessarily dependent on whether there's an agreement, a peace agreement, and it's settled. You have 20 years on where Afghanistan the poverty level is 72%. There's unemployment coming out your ears. The corruption level is phenomenally high. Criminal gangs are everywhere. Warlords are already starting to flex their muscles, whether it's Gulbuddin threatening to attack the palace, whether it's Alipur's people being attacked by the government. There's a lot of pieces in place that have been building up in the last 20 years inside of Afghanistan, that regardless of what kind of an agreement, political settlement is reached, there aren't any guarantees of there not being chaos. So I think a direct line between chaos and lack of chaos, good US-Pakistan relations, bad US-Pakistan relations, kind of puts the whole chaos on Pakistan's shoulders. If there's chaos, then it's obviously then it's going to be the relationship won't work. Well, I mean, there is so much going on in that country that has been allowed to develop over the last 20 years, some of which, of course, Pakistan has been involved in. But my goodness, you have to look at the players on the ground and who've been embraced and that. So, and the idea that the U.S. has come around to a political solution because there's been any pressure from elsewhere other than the fact that they want to get out after 20 years and they don't see themselves having a military victory in Afghanistan, when you think that the Taliban at this point has roughly control over maybe 50% of the country. So I think the political solution isn't the US sort of coming to Pakistan's point of view. I think it's the US sort of coming to what it is their strategic interest, which is, and they have a mantra, a five-word mantra that's up at the bases in Afghanistan. It's protect, safeguard national security, political solution, safeguard national security. It's a five-word mantra that's up at all the U.S. bases. So that's been up for a few years. So from the U.S.'s perspective, it's about their national interest now, safeguarding their national interest. Political solution, safeguarding national interest. That's the agenda. And it's not being pushed there, I don't think, by Pakistan. They're coming together in terms of that political solution. I will stop talking now, sorry. Anyway, those were just some of my thoughts, Rick, but anyway.
Yeah, no, well, look, Kathy, I agree with you. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the U.S. Adopted the approach that it's taking right now because of pressure from Pakistan. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting, I completely agree with your analysis, actually, that the U.S. has seen that it could not prevail militarily at any acceptable cost, either in terms of U.S. resources or levels of violence in Afghanistan. And it has come to the realization that the only real solution is a political settlement, and it is pursuing that. My only point is that brings it into alignment with Pakistan in a way that we've not had before. So, just to be clear, I don't dispute your analysis. Yeah.
It would have been fine if you had, but actually I agree with the fact that you guys are not actually that far apart. One thing I think that we will find agreement on is that, Kathy, you and Adam are indeed very far apart, because Adam's written this fantastic piece, very long and in depth, and I really, every time I read Adam, I learn from it. What I had to do was ignore the headline in order to actually read it, because with that headline, usually I don't read beyond. Then I saw Adam's name and I was like, well, Adam always makes sense. So let's see what he's actually saying. The headline is, what will it take for Pakistan to pressure the Taliban into a ceasefire? And the reason I bring this up in the way that I bring it up is exactly the point Kathy made, is how is it on Pakistan to pressure the Taliban to...
Well, I think it is, but I actually, Musharraf, if I could just say, because I hope I didn't come across thinking that Pakistan didn't have it could kick everybody out. I mean, that is how they could pressure, and at some point, violence becomes counterproductive, and so I wasn't trying to suggest that Pakistan didn't have a role to play. I was talking about something else, but in fact, can Pakistan pressure them? I think there's a lot of mistrust, but sure, Pakistan could kick everybody out. And
sure,
then,
I think, but I mean, Pakistan could
sorry,
also...
I'll stop talking.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think that sets it up. So if Kathy doesn't want to own that position, I'm very happy
I
to.
own it. No, I own it. I just don't want to hog the conversation.
No. I'm saying the other position, the position and the question that I want to pose to Adam on my own behalf and not on Kathy's behalf at all is for maybe to ask Adam to explain. Obviously, Kathy's articulated an extreme version of a manner in which the Taliban could be pressured. Just talk us through your own thinking, Adam, in putting this piece together and your own comfort level with the headline. I don't want to stress on the headline too much, but there does seem to be, not just from you, but from many other voices, like Kathy has said, Kathy's endorsed at least part of that, by saying, listen, at the end of the day, Pakistan could just kick out all the Taliban and that would do the trick. Is that something you think Pakistan is likely to do, Adam?
Thanks for having me on, Musharraf. And I'd like to say that, I agree with a lot of what both speakers have said. I think we are aligned strategically with Pakistan in principle that there should be a political solution on Afghanistan, but we're not aligned in process. And I think one example of that is, for example, I don't think Pakistan necessarily thinks that the Taliban should agree to a ceasefire prior to a political settlement, but that's up for debate. So I don't think the United States and Pakistan are aligned in terms of what the process towards a political settlement looks like. They're aligned that so far as that there should be a political settlement. I also agree with what's been said about the domestic factors in Afghanistan that have created chaos. And I think sometimes Washington sells a destructive fantasy to its Afghan partners that, but for Pakistan, everything would be okay in Afghanistan. And I've heard a lot of Afghans who are quite critical of the Ghani administration or critical of the government in general, or even critical of the post-Bond political order, still believe that but for Pakistan, everything would just work out in Afghanistan. And that's simply not true. Pakistan is one factor. There's many other factors that have been discussed already. I'm a proponent that we should not silo regional strategy. And what I mean by that is you look at the dysfunctional relationship between the US and Iran and the impact that's had on the war in Afghanistan. And you look at the dysfunctional relationship that the US and Pakistan have had and the impact that's had on the war in Afghanistan. And we can go on and on. We have US interests in the region that I think that are not stated correctly or understood correctly by Washington that are in direct conflict with one another. If we had had a more normalized relationship with Iran, perhaps the war effort in Afghanistan would have gone a little bit differently. But we essentially had to work through Pakistan exclusively, which gave Pakistan an immense burden, but also gave Pakistan some power in this situation that perhaps Washington didn't like. But I do think we should silo bilateral relationships. So we shouldn't silo regional strategy, but we should silo bilateral relations. And what I mean by that is the US-Pakistan relationship should not be viewed exclusively through the lens of Afghanistan. It's insanity to hold a relationship with a nuclear power that has a much larger population than Afghanistan, much more economic potential than Afghanistan, hostage. It's crazy to hold it hostage to outcomes in Afghanistan that are not within the control of the United States and are also not within the control of Pakistan. Now, that's not letting Pakistan off the hook, and that's not letting the mistakes that the United States has made for the last 20 years off the hook either. But we should be able to move forward with cooperation on climate change, with economic development, with helping Pakistan increase its exports in a sustainable way. Perhaps having projects that complement CPEC without necessarily endorsing the negative aspects of CPEC. We should be able to engage with Pakistan separately and compartmentalize these relations. And for too long, Washington has said, no, we're not going to have any other kind of relations with Pakistan unless we can solve Afghanistan. Now, of course, there's been other relations, but they hold those other goals hostage to outcomes in Afghanistan. And I think that is a mistake. Now, in terms of my piece, the point of the headline was that's the question that's being asked in the United States. It's not my question. It's the question that the Beltway is asking. The Beltway assumes that the only way the United States should leave Afghanistan is if there's a serious reduction in violence. We don't have to call it a ceasefire, but let's just call it a substantial reduction in violence. Ceasefire made for a better headline. That everybody knows that's how it works. And then there's also an almost unanimously accepted belief in the Beltway that Pakistan has the ability to reduce that violence. Okay, well, if you assume those two things, let's look at what leverage the United States has over Pakistan. And so I went through the FATF gray list. I talked about trying to manage Pakistan's concerns over India and Afghanistan, some of which are very legitimate, by the way, and some of which are exaggerated. And then, of course, the classic, reminding Islamabad of its own limits. And then I also advocate that Washington should realize its own limits. And a lot of folks read this very long, detailed lawfare piece, and their reaction was, okay, but that's not possible. And that's great. That in some sense, that was the intention of the piece. Now, I think some aspects of the prescriptions in my lawfare piece are achievable. I'm not saying that it was exclusively meant to shine a spotlight on the limits of Washington's leverage over Pakistan and therefore Pakistan's leverage over the Taliban. But what I am saying is it's a very tall order. And for too long in Washington, people have discussed Pakistan in very 30,000 feet terms. You could get people in the Beltway to read a 40-page report on irrigation in Helmand province, but a lot of folks are still talking about Pakistan from the Wikipedia page. Of course, not the people on this panel, but there's a lack of expertise on Pakistan in Washington. And it's actually concerning, because if there were ever a true strategic shift in power dynamics inside Pakistan, I don't even think Washington would be prepared over how to react. So that was the intent of the piece. And when people react and they say, wow, I'm not sure that those steps are really achievable, or if they are achievable, I don't think that the Biden administration is going to go through with them, I say bingo.
Well, on bingo, the question, one of the questions I had, Adam, was, which you might be answering, but I want you to answer it a bit more explicitly, just to help me. In terms of the likelihood of what Kathy suggested, and only I'm adding the qualifier to that as kind of the ultimate sort of solution, right? That Pakistan basically evicts every last Talib from Pakistan. I want to talk a little bit more about that in terms of likelihood and dynamic. How would that happen? What would it mean? And what would be the outcome of something like that? Let's start with you, Adam.
Yeah, Pakistan is in a difficult situation here, because I do think Washington over-exaggerates the leverage that Pakistan has over the Taliban, but also Islamabad under-exaggerates it. But they're also in this situation so far as optics, that they haven't left everything on the field, so to speak. They haven't evicted the Taliban leadership and their families who do live in Pakistan openly. And so from the US perspective, if you haven't done that and you say that you don't have leverage over the Taliban, it comes across as disingenuous. Although I do wonder what real effect on the ground in Afghanistan that move would have by Pakistan. I think it would have a limited effect that would be short-lived. The same way we saw that when the Taliban fled Afghanistan into Pakistan in the early days of the war, we saw a calm come over Afghanistan for a short period of time, but because of US mistakes, not Pakistani mistakes, and empowering warlords and not understanding the local dynamics on the ground, the Taliban were able to coalesce and come back into power in vast parts of Afghanistan. So I think that's what we would see if Pakistan made a move like that. I think we'd see perhaps we'd see temporary results, but without dealing with the other ground realities in Afghanistan that have already been spoken about. I don't think we would see long-lasting results. I also do understand why Pakistan hesitates from their perspective. And I'm not saying it's objectively true, but Pakistan is concerned about blowback. It does have a significant Pashtun population. I'm not saying that Pakistan's Pashtuns are sympathetic to the Taliban. In fact, I think the opposite is the case. But it does have a significant Pashtun population. It does have unrest in the tribal regions. I think it is concerned that the Taliban would align with sectarian groups in Pakistan. The Afghan Taliban would align with sectarian groups in Pakistan and begin to target the state. And of course, it does have a large Afghan refugee population. And I don't think that population is radicalized. And I think Pakistan could have taken very positive steps to integrate that population rather than having, people who are born in Pakistan who don't have ID cards. Nevertheless, I understand that Pakistan's leadership might worry about what could result from that refugee population if there was a true crackdown on the Afghan Taliban to the degree that the US wants. That's the Pakistani perspective. And I think Washington has to understand that. And I also think Pakistan's leadership is sensitive to the narrative of do more. And of course, the piece I wrote in Lawfare is the epitome of do more. But I think Pakistan's leadership is sensitive to that. And I understand why they're sensitive to that, because there have been real negative consequences in Pakistan resulting from the war on terror. Much of that is due to domestic policy on Pakistan's part. Much of that is due to homegrown radicalism and extremism on Pakistan's part. And when I say that Washington has sold a fantasy to its Afghan partners that but for Pakistan, everything would be okay in Afghanistan, Pakistan also engages in a fantasy that but for Afghanistan, everything would be okay in Pakistan, which is not the case. Pakistan is facing real extremism and non-state actors. But yeah, I think objectively Pakistan should take greater action against the Taliban, but I also understand why they stopped short of kicking every last Afghan Taliban leader out of the country.
Rick, over to you on this one. Kathy, we'll come to you after Rick, right? I just this question of why doesn't Pakistan just kick all the Taliban out? Again, having served in Islamabad and essentially being at the center of several really thorny conversations, I think things were much, much worse between the U.S. and Pakistan. When you were ambassador, having nothing to do with your ambassadorial or representative services or diplomatic skills, but things that were way out of your control and really out of many people's control. What would the reaction be if there was a bilateral conversation in which, finally, ultimately, all cards on the table, and the Americans said, look, bottom line, we don't really care what's what. You gotta remove all the Taliban. What do you think the response would be?
Well, since I had that conversation probably 60 or 70 times, I can probably attempt to address it, but let me make a couple preliminary comments. First of all, on Adam's, I want to direct to a couple things. First of all, one thing that unites the panel, I'm sure the three of us, is that all of us cannot stand what headline writers do to our pieces. That's the nature of this business. On the question of the U.S.
Listen, Rick, I hear that Kathy gets to write her own headline. So I think when you say the three of us, maybe the three men, but Kathy's like the boss at AP.
Wow, that's impressive. That's impressive power. On the question of the anti-Pakistan narratives in Afghanistan, and before serving in Pakistan, I served in Afghanistan, and I have to say I kind of disagree with Adam on this point. I think the anti-Pakistan narrative flows the other way. I think it flows very much from Afghans, at least from the Afghan elite. But I've in my travels around Afghanistan, I certainly heard a lot of demonizing of Pakistan by Afghans. I went to an ALP, Afghan local police inauguration ceremony in Sangin, in which all the elders were being told and signing up their sons for defending Afghanistan against Pakistan. That's what it was being billed as. So I think there's clearly a different dynamic. There's a more nuanced dynamic, let me say. I think, but that's a small point. On this question of every last Talib. I don't think the United States has ever actually asked for that. And in any case, I agree with Adam that I don't think that's a very realistic goal and doesn't take account of certain realities on the ground. But at the same time, what has bothered the United States is not that there are, it does bother us that yes, that the individual fighters are able to take their winter R&R on Pakistani territory, and that does give. That's a problem in terms of counterinsurgency theory. It makes it very difficult to fight a counterinsurgency, if that's what you want to do, when you have, the ability of the forces to withdraw from, from the battlefield. I mean, that's a fact. But what has really been a problem for the United States is the presence, frankly, of the Quetta Shura and the Peshawar Shura, especially the Peshawar Shura, okay? Because the Haqqanis are far and away the most lethal of all, the Taliban groups, and arguably the most effective. And I don't know this, I don't see the intelligence, but it would not surprise me in the least if it turned out that the current assassination, sticky bomb campaign in Kabul is ultimately attributable to the Haqqanis. That's just speculation, that's a guess. But in any case, there's no question that Haqqanis have been, a difficulty over the years, and I think there's equally no question that that Pakistan could, in theory, take action against them. But I also agree with Adam that Pakistan has been reluctant to do that because it would mean taking on the Haqqanis militarily within their own territory, and I think that's difficult for Pakistan. So I understand the constraints, but let's not rehash ancient history. Let's go to where we are now. What I think is important is that that Pakistan actually continue in its alignment with the U.S. In seeking a peace process in Afghanistan. But I think there's a very important point here, which is that the Taliban does have some other options. I mean, I think that the recent trip that the Taliban made, especially to Tehran, but also to Ashgabat, is about signaling that they have other alternatives, and that if the U.S. succeeds in mounting a pressure campaign on Pakistan to pressure the Taliban, that the Taliban will go elsewhere. And I think that's what everyone should read. So it does seem to me that the issue right now is a regional issue. And I think that the most constructive thing that could be done in the peace process is to set up a regional track for the peace process, in which the US can talk with all of the surrounding countries, and Pakistan can talk to all of the surrounding countries, and they can arrive at some understandings of what it would take to end the war in Afghanistan. And Adam rightly points out that the fundamental problem there is the dysfunctional U.S.-Iran relationship. And hopefully the Biden administration will be able to do something, but in any case, it shouldn't constrain in the near term some kind of contact, which even under the Trump administration, I believe, there were quiet contacts with the Iranians on Afghanistan. And I think that should continue, and perhaps under a more, slightly more benign international, mood music, it might be possible to make some progress in that area.
Thanks, Rick. I think it's really interesting you talked about the regional sort of aspect of all this and what can be done to engage the region. You mentioned the Taliban trip to Tehran. Kathy, you've written your latest piece, which I found fascinating. And I want you to unmute before you start speaking, but let me finish the question. Your latest piece is about Russia and its involvement. And it's quite stunning, actually, the contrast between the NATO conference going on literally on one side and Russia kind of running its own kind of NATO equivalent sort of high-level diplomacy. Yesterday, when General Bajwa met General McKenzie, who's the new CENTCOM chief, on the same day, within a couple of hours, he also met Zamir Kabulov. Now, Zamir, of course, has been to Pakistan dozens, maybe hundreds of times, and has been doing this for a long time. But I thought that was interesting that Russia is that active from the perspective. I mean, talk to us a little bit about the piece that you wrote and what Russia might be trying to do. Is Russia really trying to help out President Biden?
Well, I mean, I don't know what Russia's motives are at all, but I mean, Russia has been active for a couple of years. I mean, in 2019, the first meeting that the Taliban had with not the government, but certainly Hamid Karzai, Atta Mohammed, Ismail Khan, a whole group of people was in Moscow. Maybe it was even 2018. I think it was before even Khalilzad was appointed.
It was 18.
Yeah, so this is not new. Russia has been actively trying to be a player in terms of mediation. I think Rick made a very good point in terms of the latest forays by the Taliban. You know, Mullah Brother going to Iran, and Brother is very interesting. Brother is a very interesting figure in terms of appealing to some Afghans, because he had a difficult relationship with Pakistan, and now he's gone off to Iran. So I think that the Taliban are trying to figure out what to do to save the agreement. And you know that Khalilzad is talking to them because he's part of this review. And you know that he is saying and thinking that it is a regional issue, and to his credit, he did, while he was trying to put this agreement together, he did bring in the different, meet in with the different regions. He was in India, he was in Pakistan, of course not Iran, and Rick is right, if they could somehow do that, but he was in Russia, China, and the US 3 times came up with a joint statement on how to go forward on a peace agreement. So, you know, none of this is new. It's you know, and same was being said about the Afghanis is not new. And I guess for me, as I look at where it is today, and as Rick said, to keep rehashing the past, but I do think that there are some very serious issues if they are going to find a way to reach a peace agreement in Afghanistan. Of course, the regions have to all become a party to it, but there's no indication at this point that Afghanistan or even the US acknowledges Pakistan's concerns, its security concerns vis-a-vis India. Now you could say, well, that's an exaggeration. In some cases, yes, some, and some not. You know, we know that the Balochistan National Army was in Kandahar. They blew themselves up. I mean, you know, it's not a secret. So Pakistan does have concerns. So I think if there is going to be a regional discussion, there has to be a real serious regional discussion where everybody says, well, what should Pakistan do? What should Pakistan do? What is expectations of Pakistan? Well, I think somebody should also ask Pakistan, what is Pakistan's expectations of the US? What is Pakistan as a question? I mean, Afghanistan also needs to be asked. But I do think that, yes, of course, it's a regional issue, and you have to get the regional countries involved, but they have been for 3 years, more than 3 years. Where is the progress? The Afghan government is now at least face-to-face with the Taliban. Where is the progress? Who are the interlocutors on both sides? I think there has to be some real hard conversations about who's who and who are you talking to and what are you talking about and what is your best case scenario for going forward. And I don't see that happening. I sort of feel like going around in circles. I feel like that rat on a wheel, you know, keep going through the same thing. Yes, Russia is certainly involved and is another push, but it's another push. It's not a first push. It's another push too. And I'm sure it is in Russia's interest, the US's interest, to try to find a way to get a political solution. Anyway, I'll stop talking. Sorry.
Mushar, can I come in for a sec on this point? You know, I agree with you, Kathy, that, you know, Zal has been very active diplomatically, you know, within the constraints of U.S. foreign policy for the last 3 years. But that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about a regional track. You know, I think, I mean, and this, you know, I'm going to be just a diplomat here. You need a diplomatic modality, you know, which is more than just, you know, than just showing up in the Capitol and talking to people. With all due respect to Zal, I think he's done a great job. I think there needs to be, you know, a structured dialogue in which the principal players of the region come together and talk. And what it's about, and I agree with you, what it has to be about is an understanding, which I think exists in principle, but you have to kind of hammer it out, that, you know, an Afghanistan at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors is a good thing, and that everyone in the region agrees that they're not going to intervene in Afghan affairs, and they're not going to engage in proxy warfare within Afghanistan or against their neighbors through Afghan territory. I mean, that's what it's basically about. It's about, you know, getting Afghanistan to be, you know, there's not a good word. Neutral is not the right word. Non-aligned is not the right word, but something along that in that concept that there is.
Everybody says that, Rick. Yeah, but
yeah, no, I know, but I mean,
everybody says it, and they, you know, and they say yes, of course, and but there, I don't see part of that also being an acknowledgement of what are the security issues out on the table, and say, okay, well, you know, if you say you're not going to interfere, here's what it means to not interfere. Here's what we're concerned about if that you are interfering, regardless of who it is. So those conversations, I think are really important. I'm not sure, maybe that modality, as you so rightly say, is what is needed to say, well, okay, yes, we accept nobody should interfere and we're not going to interfere, but what does it mean? And what do I think you're doing? And what do you think I'm doing? And how can I prove to you that I'm not supporting this group against you, and that the intelligence isn't working against this? So I guess for that to work in a way that Afghans actually get to a peaceful life, I think is what is, I'm not sure, maybe it's what you say, you need that modality where you can have those really difficult conversations and really get to the meat of it, so that each country feels that, yes,
yeah,
I don't do this, you're not going to do that. But you can't dismiss one and say, well, you know, for God's sakes, you know, how many times do we have to hear you say that? We're telling you that's not true. There has to be a respect for each concerns and have them addressed, I think, in a way that that you can move forward. That's just my thought.
Sure.
Yeah, a modality is necessary but not sufficient. Clearly, yeah.
No, but I think it's a brilliant sort of coming together of a few themes that we've already talked about. Adam, you made the distinction between regional strategy and bilateral relations, which I think fits in exactly perfectly with this kind of conundrum of modality. You know, I think Zal's done. I thought when Zal was appointed that he would come in with his sharp elbows and say all the things he's been saying for 25, 30 years about Pakistan. And, you know, he wasn't going to be allowed in. Instead, you know, he did what a diplomat's supposed to do. So really, it's no criticism of Zalmay Khalilzad that his modality, his shuttle diplomacy had limits in terms of what it could do to bring different groups together. What I think, and this might be controversial for Americans to hear, but what I think is really now problematic is the fact that whatever modalities have been built up over the last few years have been scuttled or have failed, partly because the US, and I think particularly the Biden administration, have come in with this kind of heave-ho bloc politics, kind of back to the Cold War approach to the whole world, but certainly, you know, the region or the regions that Pakistan is a part of. Specifically, the SCO invitation for India and Pakistan by Moscow and Beijing. If you have any thoughts on that, all three of you, I'd love to hear those. More recently, and I think more less well known, is what I call the Quad for Good. China, Pakistan, the US, and Afghanistan. There was a quadrilateral group. It was called the Quadrilateral Coordination Group. I think, Rick, correct me if I'm wrong, but it began while you were still here. And the last meeting, I think, was in 17 or 18. And then obviously Zal took over. That kind of fell by the wayside. And now, for me to imagine that there could be such a quad again, given the way in which Blinken, Biden, Sullivan, the entire administration have positioned themselves vis-a-vis China is madness. And so the question then becomes, is there any chance, given these postures, that some of these convergences and overlaps can be utilized in a way that will serve the people of Afghanistan? Or are we going to keep doing big games and medium games so that the little games are Afghan civil society activists and human rights activists and journalists getting killed every single day?
I have a few thoughts, if I could add them. I agree that we need to get away from the shotgun diplomacy of the Trump era, and perhaps Tom West joining Khalilzad's team suggests that the Biden administration understands that. But I'd also caution against engaging in a diplomatic structure that assumes that we have years to deal with this problem. When I look already at how the Biden administration is tackling diplomacy, they're doing it in a very professional way, but they also assume it's almost zero sum. You look at how they're handling the JCPOA, there's an assumption that, well, now there's other concerns that maybe they can address with the agreement, even though the US unilaterally broke the agreement. And when we talk about regionalism versus bilateral relationships, to have an integrated regional approach that is not siloed, you have to have priorities. And as Ambassador Olson said at the beginning, the priorities might be climate change in China and Afghanistan at the bottom, but the urgency is Afghanistan at the top. And so is the Biden administration willing to make compromises on its Indo-Pacific strategy? I mean, I address this in the lawfare piece. The Indo-Pacific strategy, and not the Quad for good, but the Quad, between India and Asian countries and the US, that doesn't really address India's concerns when it comes to Afghanistan and Pakistan. Or when it comes even to, it doesn't even address India's concerns when it comes to border disputes with China. It's very focused on interests that matter to the Biden administration. Is the Biden administration willing to prioritize Afghanistan over these other initiatives? Is the Biden administration willing to get Iran's help on Afghanistan at the risk of giving Iran a little bit of leverage when it comes to the JCPOA negotiations? Is the Biden administration willing to put Afghanistan before this Cold War type policy that's emerging with China? And I'm not sure it's willing to do that, which is why I question if a drawn out regional diplomatic approach to resolving the war in Afghanistan will actually work at the end of the day. I think it in theory, it's a great idea, but is the Biden administration willing to make the compromises necessary to do that? And that's why I'm deeply concerned that the US could just get drawn back into a repeat of the last decade.
Yeah, can I go
Yeah.
ahead? Yeah, first of all, just on the Quad that you described, the Quadrilateral Coordinating Group, it was actually set up in December of 2015 in Islamabad. And it was set up in a meeting between Tony Blinken, who was then Deputy Secretary of State, and his Chinese counterpart. When I was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, I sort of saw it through its lifespan, which was really actively about 6 months. And what you may recall, the reason it kind of broke apart at the end was because we had, the meetings of the four parties, Pakistan, Afghanistan, US, and China, repeatedly, intensively. But we felt that we couldn't get anywhere further without bringing the Taliban to the table in terms of the peace process. And we invited the Taliban to come, and the Taliban refused twice. This was under Mullah Mansour, and if I may say so, that was Mullah Mansour's fatal mistake, to be quite blunt. So that's how the Quad sort of came to an end. I think it was a useful initiative, and maybe can be resurrected in some form, but I would say now it is inadequate because you need to have other regional players. You need to have Russia, you need to have Iran at a minimum. I would say, my audience may not like this. You need to have India at the table, and Pakistan needs to have India at the table so that it's part and parcel whatever agreements come out regarding Afghanistan. I just also wanted to address the a couple other points that Adam made. First of all, on structures within the U.S. government with regard to to Indo-Pacific and coherence and things like this. I know this is a bit nerdy, but I have to say that I'm encouraged by how the NSC is being set up. That you have Kurt Campbell as the Asia czar, and he has reporting to him the South Asia Directorate, as well as the Central Asia Directorate, and of course the East Asia Directorate. And all of this suggests that these kinds of trade-offs between policy that are necessary could, in principle, happen. I mean, I agree with Adam that they maybe haven't happened so far. It's early days, but I think that at least the structure is better than what it was before. And first of all, it's not AFPAC anymore, and I mean, we are finally done with AFPAC, or even worse, the Bush era construct of putting Iraq and Afghanistan together, which had two countries that have nothing to do with each other. So, I think that's progress. And in terms of, Cold War with China, I don't, it may wind up there, but I think the Biden administration is signaling a more nuanced approach. Yes, there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington right now that China is the challenge of our times, and that China is pursuing policies that are inimical to U.S. interests. But that doesn't necessarily, I think the Trump administration was headed much more towards a containment strategy, focused on the Communist Party of China, and ultimately focused on regime change, which was frankly absurd to my way of thinking. And I think that the Biden administration is going to take a more nuanced approach of building partnerships throughout the region on primarily on an economic basis, and I'd hope we get to talk about that. Last thing. Adam talked about a drawn-out peace process, and I tend to agree with him that I think I would be skeptical about the ability to have a drawn-out peace process. I personally think there's a real possibility that Zhao will pull another rabbit out of a hat, and that he will, in fact, be able to pull off some kind of interim government arrangement before the May deadline, before the troop withdrawal, and if he did that, if he succeeded in doing that, and it would require Pakistan's help, then I think, we would really truly be in some kind of Afghanistan endgame. Would that generate an Afghanistan that looks like Denmark? Probably not, but that may be where we wind up.
Kathy, I heard Mullah Baradar speak at a track 2 or whatever, I guess, if the Islamic Emirate is official, then maybe a track 1.5 a couple of months ago. And my own impression was that this is not a group or a leadership that is in any way feeling any kind of nervousness, that the quantum of confidence was, frankly, I was a little bit surprised by it, given that it was still in the middle of what we think is a process. Ambassador Olson has just suggested, a rabbit out of a hat, inshallah, of course. I mean, that's really the hope that I think everyone in Afghanistan and Pakistan would have. But given the posture of the Taliban, the spate of assassinations, which I've written about this, that certainly it seems that the Taliban there must be some Taliban that are involved, but it's also likely that there are other groups involved, including groups that are associated with the government. And I think that's for me, one of the key questions is an interim government. Really, the biggest obstacle in that isn't really the Taliban or Pakistan or the US, is it? The biggest obstacle is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, or the people representing the Islamic Republic, specifically President Ashraf Ghani. Is that an unfair characterization?
That President Ghani is the hold-up to an interim government?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think he's been quite clear that his term is until 2024, and he has said that the Constitution, he would abide by the Constitution. So I think, in his own words, he's been quite clear that he does not see an interim government or a stepping down as a course that he would choose. So I think that, and of course, there are a lot of different voices in Afghanistan, and there's Dr. Abdullah, and you've got, of course, Hamid Karzai, and you've got all the many other significant players, many of them warlords. So I think the getting to an interim government is not an easy task, and I'm not even sure who you would have on this interim government, to tell you the truth, that everybody would agree on. I guess for Afghans, they are struggling to find out, whichever route is taken, how can they feel that their future is going to be quite secure. And regardless of the scenarios at this point, and this is a bit of an indictment after 20 years of international presence and hundreds of billions of dollars, I think for many Afghans, they're having trouble seeing, given who the players are on all sides, on both sides of the conflict, how, regardless of what is the final decision or final agreement, which may give the cover or give whatever is necessary for the US to leave. And there's a lot of hurdles to a peaceful Afghanistan, and all these things that we have been talking about, I think are all very important. I think for Afghans who are now leaving their country, who never left, whether during Najib's time or the Mujahideen time or the Taliban time, are leaving now or are moving their families out. I think we have to look very hard at why this is happening and what does that mean. That doesn't answer your question, but I've been wanting to get this in, where Afghans feel their country is today. I think, of course, there will be some agreement. Can President Ghani be strong-armed into agreeing to an interim? 75% of the budget is international money, 80%. The security forces are funded by $4 billion of US money. Of course, strong-arm tactics can be used, and an agreement can be reached. Brother, yes, the Taliban are quite confident, I'm sure, but they also need a solution. You know, they might be outside of Kandahar, but they have shown that they're not really able to take a city and hold it. They had parts of Ghazni, they couldn't keep it. Let's not make the same mistake that everybody made when the Russians left in 1989. I was outside of Jalalabad. Everybody said, you know, I mean, the Arabs were there, everybody was there, and they said Jalalabad's going to fall. It's just going to be a matter of days. And 3 years later, Najib negotiated his way out of Kabul. So I think where we are today is a very difficult position. I think that at some point, because all the key players need to find an exit strategy. Unfortunately, the US didn't go in with an exit strategy, and I guess, nor did NATO, perhaps, and we're now seeing how do they come up with one now. So I guess at the end of the day, there will be some agreement if everybody is insisting on it, and everybody is. How it holds up, I guess for me, given all the players, is a huge question mark. And at the end of the day, it's the Afghans again, you know, that are going to, whether diplomats here, regional players here, you know, you want to get Iran, get Ryan Crocker back talking to the Iranians. You know, he was talking to Tehrani until Bush came up with this axis of evil speech. They blew them both away. The Iranians were helping the Americans in the first days after the fall of the Taliban. You know, get them back talking, you know, backdoor. You can get some of that going again, I assume. But I'm just not sure how it all ends up playing out in the end that gives Afghans peace and stability. I guess I'm just not clear on how that happens. That does not answer your question, Musharraf. I'm so sorry.
No, I think it raises new ones, and I think that's really the purpose of these conversations. it made me think, because I think you're so right to kind of focus on the Afghan people. And I think we should be sort of now building towards the end, given that we've taken so much of your time. All three of you have been fantastic today. Adam, while Kathy was talking about the Afghan people, I kept thinking, in the 80s, we didn't have an Afghanistan-Pakistan transit trade agreement that actually was worth serious money. Not huge money, but significant. We didn't have, a border that was fenced, where now you can actually track movements in and out of Pakistan, both at Torkham and at Spin Boldak or at Chaman, as well as other posts. You didn't have the kind of work that's been going on in Pakistan in terms of markets being developed along the border. You didn't have the normalization of the formerly federally administered tribal areas. You didn't have the registration of all Afghans in Pakistan, whether they're refugees or they have ACC cards or they're undocumented. Even the undocumented ones, there are some very precise estimates, and the system knows where they are and who they are. So given all this new information and the opportunities this creates to serve the Afghan people, as opposed to leading to something like what happened in the 80s, how hopeful are you that the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship in and of itself can be a kind of bulwark against the potential spinning out of control of things in Kabul and beyond?
Well, it could be. I agree that all of those are very significant developments, although I would like to see the FATA merger move forward in a more real way rather than just on the books. I know changes have been made, and I know it's difficult to merge FATA and KP and PATA, but I just would like to see more progress on that. I think that would be beneficial to security. I also think defense is a real achievement that is oftentimes derided by the U.S. and Afghanistan. But of course, with that achievement comes responsibility for movements of radical people that will be placed on Pakistan's shoulders to some degree. I think without a settlement, I don't see how the relationship and the increased economic ties can act as a bulwark. I want to go back to something that Ambassador Olson said, which was the anti-Pakistan vitriol that exists in Afghanistan. And if I could amend something I said earlier, I don't think it's just a fantasy that Washington has sold to the Afghans. I think it's something that Washington has at times reinforced. Another narrative that Washington has reinforced is this notion that Afghanistan is the center of the world, and that the United States is going to remain there because it's crucial to U.S. strategic interests, and it just isn't, and the Afghans need to accept that. There is an ethno-nationalism that exists in Afghanistan. There's people who identify first by their ethnicity, and then there's people that are extremely nationalistic, and there is a hatred of Pakistan in Afghanistan, and I don't know what other word to use. And that's going to be a very difficult barrier to overcome. I also think that the Taliban are delusional when it comes to their big picture analysis, because I think they're forfeiting incredible opportunities right now. But I do understand why they have confidence in their military abilities, because while they haven't held provincial capitals in the past, there's been a professionalization of the Taliban in recent years. They have mobile units now. They've demonstrated that they're able to surround provincial capitals and then infiltrate them and have mobile units inside the provincial capital at the time of the assault, rather than just having a human wave of Taliban who are susceptible to close air support. So I think that there is their ability to take provincial capitals. I understand why they think that. And of course, they've also had the experience of the falling out of the Quetta Shura with Pakistan, and they've seen that they were able to get support from Iran. So they have the confidence that they think they can play regional players against each other and shift from one to the other. How true that is today, I don't know, but I think that informs their confidence and their thinking. That being said, you can't develop these trade agreements, these economic corridors, these people-to-people ties overnight. So even as things remain dismal in Afghanistan, it's important for Pakistan to keep pushing these initiatives forward, and I think Washington should support them. And one of the things I like about the Tabadla report is it does get into the details that aren't sexy in Washington when it comes to CPEC and when it comes to trade. And these are things that Washington doesn't want to talk about, but you can't build these infrastructures overnight. And they are key to the long-term security. But the catch-22 for US policy everywhere is always that the short-term Band-Aid takes precedence over the long-term solution.
Yeah, I was hoping that we could get something that would end on a positive. Ambassador Olson, maybe we can try with you. You know, I think Adam's prognosis that the short term trumps, you know, kind of medium and longer term. I don't know if longer term even exists anymore, or if it ever did. But in the short run, it is actually going to be Afghanistan that will determine the shape of the Pakistan-US relationship. Is what I'm hearing from not just Adam but from all three of you. What gives you hope that might go well and that Afghanistan will not descend into total sort of chaos, regardless of what happens on May 1st? Whether there's an extension or not, a lot of people seem to believe that the only end in Afghanistan is civil war. Tell us something that gives us reason to believe that it isn't, as your closing sort of argument.
Well, you know, it's very hard to paint, you know, a rosy scenario for Afghanistan. Okay, and you know, and if I did so, I think I would be probably, you know, immediately I'd be very open to attack. You know, I mean, I think that the pathways to you know, a happy outcome in Afghanistan, or you know, or a less miserable outcome, are very narrow, and the possibilities of civil war are broad avenues. You know, I mean, so you know, let's just say that. But you know, I do think that there is a possibility of using the current instruments of the peace process and adding, you know, a little more of an invigorated regional, you know, piece to this. Are significant, and the United States is committed to the peace process. I mean, Kathy's, you know, mentioning you know, the slogan that's up on the walls, you know, with RSM outposts. I mean, it's true that at this point, I think the U.S. government has accepted that its troop presence in Afghanistan is primarily about the peace process. And you know, the question of the withdrawal or lack or non-withdrawal on May 1st, you know, which is the issue that everyone is getting spending a lot of time on in Washington right now, is not about the utility of force, right? I mean, there is a utility of force argument to be made about whether that's the right level of troops, but the argument is principally what impact it would have on the peace process. So, look, I think there's a slim possibility, you know, in the first instance, Zal may be able to pull her out of a hat and get some kind of agreement before May 1st. I think if that doesn't work, I think there's a possibility of some short extension of the May deadline if it's properly negotiated with the Taliban. And again, Zal is absolutely the person to do that. You know, and if that time is used productively, and the Republic and the Taliban negotiate a new political dispensation for Afghanistan, that would be great. I think the odds of any of these things happening are kind of a little bit slim. But I think that, you know, you have to pursue your policy on the basis of some degree of optimism. You know, you can't pursue policy purely on the basis of pessimism, or you just don't do anything at all.
So true. Kathy, you get the final word, just like you opened up.
Sure.
I want to posit something that I believe to be true, and maybe get your reaction and your thoughts on trying to close on a positive note. No country on the planet has a greater payoff, a greater premium that it will receive and it will get from Afghanistan not descending into civil war than Pakistan. Having understood this region, both these countries, and spent as much time as you have, do you think that this is that this idea or this notion is something that is understood by Pakistani decision makers, the Pakistani military, the current government, senior leaders like Ambassador Sadiq and others? Or do you think that myopia will continue to play, from a historical perspective, decision making in Pakistan? And again, not that this is all on Pakistan, but certainly that the benefits of sustained peace in Afghanistan, outside of the Afghan people, the biggest beneficiaries will be Pakistanis, no?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I think Pakistan absolutely understands that a civil war in Afghanistan will hurt them in so many ways. I think a civil war in Afghanistan might not have that much to do with Pakistan, quite honestly, and so that's a different subject altogether. But I certainly think at this point in history, I think Pakistan, Afghanistan, there is a real desire for some solution, and people are grasping at straws, and so there is a hope. Of course, there's still the blame game. Problem that has always been a little bit problematic for Afghanistan has been that desire for power and that inability to share, compromise on power, and I'm not sure that has changed a great deal, or and how does that change? So that's a problem, I think. But I think certainly I think Pakistan civil war will do more harm for Pakistan, absolutely, for Iran if there's a civil war. So I don't think there's any issue on that. I think for Afghans, if I could just have a last say on behalf of Afghans, I think there is a lack of, for sure there's a hate for Pakistan, no question. I mean, and mistrust and everything. But even I've noticed in the last few years, it is now much more equally spread among all players, whether it's government, whether it's regional, whether it's America, whether it's... So for Afghans 20 years on, I think it's a really difficult position that they're in, and people talk about optimism, pessimism, and I think right now for Afghans is they see that if there's any chance at peace, take it, whatever that means, and just come up with something so that you can put an end to the fighting. And the longer the Taliban refuse, the more it works against them, because there is a sense that, gee, at least under the Taliban there was security, and there isn't now. So, the longer there's this continued refusal on a ceasefire, it's counterproductive for whatever the Taliban might think successes they have. From the government side, it's counterproductive to insist that this is what our power has to look like from an Afghan perspective. And the US and the international community is quite tarnished among Afghans in terms of their sense of how life has improved for them, and how true the international community has been to Afghans. That's it for me on and coming from the Afghan perspective.
I appreciate that. Of course, as you know, we love having conversations like this, and this one was specifically to look at Afghanistan through this Pak-US lens. But we've had many Afghans appear on this platform to talk about not just Afghanistan, but the region, and we will continue to do that. But nevertheless, it's never enough to talk about what's the most important thing in these conversations, and that is the well-being, the safety, the security, and the prosperity of the Afghan people. On that note, and a shared interest across all four of us, across many, many miles, thank you for making time. I know how early it was for you, Ambassador Olson, and Adam, perhaps even more so for you. So bless you for, I guess, burning the early morning oil for us. And I hope all three of you will come back real soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Very soon.
Thank you. Nice seeing everybody. Bye.
Great talking.
Bye.
Thanks for making time. Bye-bye.